Spring 1984, Springfield, Missouri, April 15th, Memorial Hospital Maternity Ward. A story that began with maternal instinct and ended with a 15-year sentence. A young woman looks at the infant the nurses brought her and knows, this is not her child. The blood type doesn't match, the birthmark is wrong, even the cry is different. When she starts asking questions, they tell her she's suffering from postpartum psychosis. But she's not crazy. She's a mother, and she will search for the truth for 8 years until she compiles a file on 47 switched babies and delivers it to the FBI. What were the white coats of Memorial Hospital's maternity ward hiding? Why were healthy infants given to some families and sick ones to others? And how many mothers lived for years with strangers' children, never knowing the truth? Springfield, Missouri, April 15th, 1984. Sunday. Memorial Hospital stood as an imposing brick building on the corner of Jefferson and Main, built in the 1920s with high ceilings, long corridors with peeling paint, and the smell of disinfectant and formula. Spring was just beginning. Patches of dirty snow still dotted the parking lot, but something new was seeping through the windows. Anxious April sunlight that highlighted every crack in the walls. Margaret Hartwell lay in the postpartum ward on the 4th floor. She was 24 years old, worked as a design engineer at Emerson Electric, and had given birth to her first child 3 days ago, on April 12th, Thursday, at exactly 3:47 a.m. She remembered the time to the second because at the moment when the delivery nurse lifted her son and spanked his bottom, the wall clock showed exactly that time. Labor had been difficult, nearly 8 hours, but when she heard that first cry, all the pain vanished. A boy. Healthy. 7 pounds, 9 ounces, 20.5 inches. Loud-voiced, red-faced, with a shock of dark hair. Margaret only got a glimpse of him. The nurse showed her son for just a moment, then carried him away. For processing, they told her. This was standard procedure. In American hospitals, babies weren't left with mothers immediately after birth. They were taken to the nursery, washed, wrapped, and only then, after several hours, brought for the first feeding. Margaret remembered every detail. Dark hair, exactly like her husband Dennis's. A small birthmark on his left shoulder that she'd managed to notice. Blood type, O positive. They'd told her this during delivery when they took the cord blood sample. Margaret had type A, Dennis had type O. Made sense. The first feeding was scheduled for 6 hours later. Margaret was moved to a postpartum room where she lay with 3 other women. All had delivered boys. All were happy, exhausted, speaking in whispers so as not to disturb each other. Time crawled agonizingly slowly. Margaret couldn't sleep. She wanted to see her son, hold him to her chest, smell him. At 10 a.m., a nurse entered the room, a heavy-set woman in her 50s with a tired face and a name tag reading P. Donovan, R.N. She wheeled a cart with 4 bundles in front of her. "Feeding time, ladies," she announced in a tone that brooked no argument. She began distributing the infants, checking the tags on their tiny wrists. "Hartwell?" she asked. Margaret raised her hand. The nurse placed a tightly swaddled bundle in her arms. Margaret looked at the infant, and her heart stopped. This was not her child. She knew it immediately, with that absolute certainty that requires no proof. This infant's hair was light, almost pale blonde. The skin, pale, almost translucent. The face, different, completely different. Margaret had given birth to a large, red-faced boy with dark hair. This infant was smaller, paler, with light hair.
"Wait," Margaret said, and her voice sounded strange, as if it belonged to someone else.
"This isn't my baby." Nurse Donovan stopped at the door. She turned slowly, with an expression of weary irritation on her face. "Excuse me?" "This isn't my baby," Margaret repeated. Her voice trembled. "My son had dark hair. This one is blonde. This isn't him." Silence fell over the room. The three other women who had already begun nursing looked up. Nurse Donovan sighed heavily, as if this scene had repeated hundreds of times and had long since tired her. "Mrs. Hartwell," she said condescendingly, "all newborns change in the first few days. Hair darkens or lightens. It's normal. You're experiencing postpartum hormones. Things seem different. Check the bracelet." Margaret looked at the tiny bracelet on the infant's wrist. It read, "Hartwell, M. Male. April 12th, 1984. 3:47 a.m. The time matched. The name matched. But the baby was different. "Check the blood type," Margaret said. Everything inside clenched with fear, but she forced herself to speak firmly. "My son was type O. Check this one." Nurse Donovan's face hardened. "Mrs. Hartwell, you're beginning to behave inappropriately. This is your child. If you refuse to feed him, I'll have to take him back and we'll have you transferred to the psychiatric ward for observation. Postpartum psychosis is a serious condition." The threat was clear. Margaret knew that in 1984, psychiatric commitment was a tool. Difficult people could easily be declared incompetent. They could isolate her, drug her, and she'd never find her son. She swallowed, pressed the strange infant to her chest, and fell silent. Nurse Donovan nodded with satisfaction and left the room. Margaret sat on the bed holding someone else's baby, feeling cold, methodical rage growing inside. This was not her son. She knew it with every cell in her body. Maternal instinct doesn't lie. The question was, where was her real child, and why had they given her someone else's? She looked at the other women in the room. All three were nursing their infants, not looking up. One of them, a young woman about 20 named Lisa, met her gaze and quickly looked away. There was something in her face. Knowledge? Sympathy? Fear? Margaret began to nurse. The strange infant suckled weakly, dozing and waking. He had a quiet, plaintive cry, nothing like the powerful roar her son had made at birth. She looked at his little face and thought, "Where is my boy? Who's feeding him? Is he crying, sensing a stranger next to him?" After half an hour, Nurse Donovan returned and collected the infants. Margaret watched the strange baby being taken away, feeling like a traitor. She couldn't refuse him. That would mean admitting she was crazy. But she couldn't accept him as her own either. When the nurse left, Lisa, who was in the next bed, quietly called to her. "Margaret," she whispered, "come here." Margaret got up, approached. Lisa grabbed her hand and pressed her lips to her ear. "Me too," she whispered so quietly Margaret could barely hear. "They gave me the wrong baby too. I delivered a girl with black hair. They gave me a blonde. But I'm afraid to say anything. They say if you make trouble, they might not give you your baby at all. Say it died." Margaret felt the hair rise on the back of her neck. "What does this mean?" she whispered. Lisa shook her head. Her eyes were full of tears. "I don't know. But you're not the first. My coworker delivered here 2 years ago. She said they gave her the wrong baby too. They referred her to a psychiatrist. Now she's quiet, raising the girl, but I see how she looks at her. She doesn't recognize herself in her." At that moment, the door swung open. Dr. Eleanor Blackwood, the hospital's head of obstetrics, entered the room. A tall, gaunt woman in her mid-50s with iron-gray hair pulled into a tight bun and cold gray eyes behind thin-framed glasses. She was a legend at Memorial Hospital, had worked there for 30 years, since before the war. They said she'd delivered babies during the polio epidemic when both mothers and infants died more often than they survived. "Mrs. Hartwell," Dr. Blackwood said in a voice that made blood freeze. It was the voice of someone accustomed to absolute authority. "I understand you're refusing to acknowledge your child. This is very serious. Maternal rejection. We'll be forced to report to Child Protective Services. Margaret got up from Lisa's bed and turned to the chief. She was an engineer, used to logic, precision, evidence. "Dr. Blackwood," she said as calmly as possible, "I'm not refusing my child. I'm simply asking you to check the blood type. It'll take 5 minutes. My son had type O at birth. Check this infant. If the types match, I'll immediately acknowledge my mistake." Dr. Blackwood looked at her with a long, assessing gaze. In the chief's eyes, Margaret saw something that made her heart clench. It wasn't anger. It was calculation. Cold, cynical calculation. "Fine," Dr. Blackwood finally said. "We'll run the test. But if the blood type matches, you'll sign a statement that you have no complaints against the hospital and that your claims were caused by postpartum distress. Agreed?" "Agreed," Margaret said. Dr. Blackwood nodded and left. Margaret sat on her bed, feeling her hands shake. She was confident of the result. The blood type wouldn't match. And then what? Then she'd have to demand explanations. Demand they find her son. But what if they declared her insane? What if they took both children, the real one and the one they'd substituted? They ran the test that evening. Margaret was taken to a procedure room. They drew her blood, then brought the infant and drew blood from his heel. The baby cried thinly and plaintively. Margaret looked at him and thought, "Who are you? Whose son are you? Where is your real mother?" They announced the result the next morning, April 16th, Monday. Dr. Blackwood came to Margaret's room accompanied by Nurse Donovan and another person, a man in a suit who introduced himself as a representative from the Missouri Department of Health and Senior Services. "Mrs. Hartwell," Dr. Blackwood said, "the results are ready. You have type A blood, Rh positive. Your son has type O blood, Rh positive. This is completely consistent with genetics, as your husband has type O. Are you satisfied?" Margaret felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. "That's impossible," she whispered. "I saw it. At birth he had type O, they told me." "You imagined it," Dr. Blackwood said harshly. "In the stress of delivery, many things seem different than they are. Now sign the statement." They handed her a paper. Margaret looked at the text. It stated that she acknowledged her son, renounced all claims, and confirmed that her statements had been caused by temporary postpartum confusion. At the bottom was a line for her signature. "What if I don't sign?" Margaret asked. The man in the suit spoke for the first time. He had a soft, almost gentle voice, which made his words even more frightening. "Then we'll be forced to initiate proceedings to terminate your parental rights. A woman who refuses to acknowledge her own child is clearly not capable of raising him. The child will be placed in foster care. You'll be referred for mandatory psychiatric treatment. Your husband will receive notice of divorce proceedings. This is standard procedure." Margaret took the pen. Her hand shook so badly the signature came out crooked, barely legible. But she signed. What choice did she have? They discharged her 5 days later, April 20th, Friday. Dennis came for her in their station wagon, happy, excited, with a bouquet of carnations. He was 7 years older than Margaret, an electrical engineer, worked at the same company. A good, reliable man, the kind mothers say he'll make a good husband about. They'd married 2 years ago, rented an apartment in a complex near Phelps Grove Park, were saving for a house. The baby had been planned, wanted. Dennis took the bundle with the infant in his arms and beamed. "Look at this handsome guy. Looks just like you, fair-haired." Margaret was silent. She couldn't tell her husband the truth. She didn't even know if he'd believe her. And if you did, what then? He'd make a scene, demand answers, and they'd declare him crazy too. No, she needed evidence, solid, irrefutable evidence. They came home. The apartment was small, 800 square feet, but Dennis had tried, bought a crib, hung new curtains, even got an imported pacifier somewhere. Margaret laid the infant in the crib and sat next to him. She looked at him and tried to feel something. Maternal love, attachment, anything.
But inside there was only emptiness and dull, methodical pain. Dennis was happy. He talked about how he'd bragged at work, how everyone congratulated him, how her mother promised a visit from St. Louis in a week. Margaret nodded, smiled, said the right words. But inside she'd already made a decision. She would find her son, whatever it took. The first thing she did was call the hospital the next day and request a copy of the medical records. They refused. Records aren't released to patients, the registrar said. Margaret asked her husband, who had a lawyer friend. He explained, under American law, parents have the right to examine their child's medical documentation, but not to obtain copies without a specific reason. Dead end. She took another route. A week later, when Dennis was at work, she went to Memorial Hospital and asked to meet with the delivery nurse who'd attended her birth. Her name was Judith Crawford, a woman in her 40s with a kind, tired face. Margaret found her in the staff lounge during lunch break. "Nurse Crawford," she said, "I'm Margaret Hartwell. You delivered my baby on April 12th. I wanted to ask, do you remember my baby's blood type for certain?" Judith became guarded. "Why?" "I thought it was type O. I heard you tell the lab tech." The nurse's face became impenetrable. "Mrs. Hartwell, I deliver 20 babies a week. I don't remember every blood type. The chart says O, so it's O." "But you took the cord blood sample? You sent it to the lab?" "Yes, I sent it, and the result was type O." Judith stood up. "Mrs. Hartwell, I understand your state. Postpartum depression is serious. You need to see a doctor. I can give you a referral to a therapist, a good one. Won't put you on any permanent record, just talk." "I'm not crazy," Margaret said quietly. "They gave me someone else's baby." Judith looked into her eyes. In her gaze was a strange mixture of pity and fear. "Listen to me carefully," she said very quietly, glancing at the door. "Forget about this. Raise the child they gave you. Love him. Become his real mother. That's the only right path." "Where is my son?" Margaret asked. "I don't have an answer to that question," Judith said, and left the lounge. Margaret stood in the empty room, feeling cold rage building inside. She wasn't crazy. She didn't have postpartum depression. They'd stolen her child and given her someone else's, and everyone knew, and everyone was silent. She began to act methodically, like an engineer used to systematic work. First, she found Lisa, that girl who'd been in the room with her, got her address through the hospital saying she wanted to congratulate her. Lisa lived on the outskirts, in an apartment complex on National Avenue. Margaret came to her with a cake as if visiting. Lisa opened the door, saw Margaret, and went pale. "Why did you come?" "To talk," Margaret said. "Just talk." They sat in the kitchen of the tiny one-bedroom apartment. Lisa's daughter slept in a bassinet. Fair-haired, pale girl. "You were right," Lisa finally said. "This isn't my daughter. I delivered a girl with black hair and olive skin, exactly like my husband. He's Greek. They gave me this one, blonde, blue-eyed. But I can't do anything, understand? Nothing. My husband works at the brewery. If I make trouble, they'll fire him, or worse. They told me straight out, if you make waves, we'll have your husband arrested. They'll find something to charge him with." "Who told you?" "Dr. Blackwood. She called me in on the second day after delivery and explained how things would develop if I didn't shut up. Very detailed explanation." Margaret felt her nails digging into her palms. "So this is a system, not a mistake, not an accident. A system." "Yes," Lisa whispered. "They switch babies.
on purpose. And it's been happening for years. Why? What for? Lisa shook her head. I don't know. I heard they say healthy babies go to those who pay, rich people, influential people, and sick ones, or ones with problems, they go to regular people. But that's just rumors. I don't know for sure. Margaret left Lisa's with addresses of 3 more women who'd delivered at Memorial Hospital and also complained about switches. Over 2 months, she met with 7 mothers. All told similar stories. All had been given the wrong babies. All had been intimidated. All had been threatened with psychiatric commitment, their husbands' jobs, child removal. The system worked flawlessly because the mothers had no choice. The baby you're given is still a baby. Your real one is somewhere out there with strangers. If you make a scene, you'll lose both. You'll be left with nothing. But Margaret was an engineer. She knew any system has a weak link. She just had to find it. The weak link turned out to be a lab technician, a young woman about 22 named Cheryl Morrison. Margaret tracked her down outside the hospital entrance in late May, approached her as if by chance, struck up a conversation, invited her to a coffee shop on the corner. Cheryl was a simple girl from a working-class family, recently out of community college, had been working at the hospital for 6 months. Margaret talked to her for a long time, carefully, avoiding dangerous topics, building trust. And only at the end, when they'd each had 2 cups of coffee, did she ask the main question. Cheryl, tell me honestly, the blood tests on newborns, are they sometimes switched? The girl's face changed. She went pale, started to get up. I don't know what you're talking about. I need to go. Margaret grabbed her hand. Wait, please. I don't want to get you in trouble. I just want to know the truth. They took my son. I have a right to know where he is. Cheryl sat back down. Her hands were shaking. If I tell you, they'll kill me. Understand? Actually kill me, not figuratively. No one will know, I swear. Cheryl was silent for a long time. Then she spoke quickly, quietly, staring into her empty cup. Yes, they switched them, not me. The senior lab tech, Sharon Henderson. They bring her blood samples, she writes a different type in the chart. Or vice versa, writes one type in the chart, another in the lab log. When parents demand verification, they show them the fake chart. Or they retest the baby that's already been switched. The system is refined. I see it every day. But I keep quiet because I'm afraid. Henderson has connections. Her husband works for the Springfield Police Department. High position. What's his name? Margaret asked, taking out a notebook. Henderson. Robert Henderson. Lieutenant. Margaret wrote it down. How many babies do they switch, approximately? Several times a year, sometimes more, sometimes less. They select healthy ones, strong ones, from young mothers, preferably educated, means good genetics. These babies go to whoever needs them. And in their place, they substitute babies with problems, heart conditions, developmental issues, minor deformities. Their mothers usually refuse, sign relinquishments. Then those babies get redistributed in exchange. Who gets the healthy ones? Rich people, influential people, those who can't have children or whose children died or who need a specifically healthy baby without genetic problems. They pay big money. Dr. Blackwood runs the whole scheme. She decides who to take from whom, who to give to. How long has this been going on? Years. I heard since the 60s, but I don't know for sure. Margaret, please, forget this conversation. If they find out, I'm dead. And you too. They parted. Margaret walked through May Springfield and understood she'd stumbled onto a monstrous machine. A machine for trafficking children. Children were merchandise. Healthy ones were sold to those who could pay. Sick ones were offloaded to the poor who wouldn't dare object. And if someone tried to rebel, they were broken with threats, psychiatric commitment, pressure on their family. Now the question was, what could she do? Go to the police? Pointless. The senior lab tech's husband was a police lieutenant. That meant he was in on it. The scheme couldn't work without protection. Go to the FBI? Possibly. But without evidence, they simply wouldn't listen to her. And where was the evidence? Medical charts were falsified, tests were redone, witnesses were intimidated. She needed documents, irrefutable documents. And Margaret began to collect them. She worked methodically, like going to war. Every evening when Dennis was asleep, she'd take out a thick notebook and write down everything she'd learned. Names of mothers whose babies were switched, delivery dates, descriptions of newborns, the ones they'd seen at birth and the ones given instead, blood types, addresses, witness statements. She recorded everything verbatim, with dates, with details. By the end of summer 1984, she had a file on 11 switch cases, but it wasn't enough. She needed documents from inside the hospital, medical charts, lab logs, something that could prove the fraud. In September 1984, she went back to Cheryl, met on the Missouri State University campus among students. Margaret proposed a plan. Cheryl would secretly photograph the lab logs where corrections and discrepancies were visible. Margaret had a Minolta with good optics. They could take pictures of the pages. This would be evidence. Cheryl refused. "You want me killed? No. Find other ways." Margaret searched. In the fall, she befriended a hospital janitor, a woman about 50 named Claudia. She worked part-time cleaning in the nursery. Margaret paid her $100, huge money in those days, to write down which babies were in the nursery on certain days and compare them with who was given to the mothers. Claudia agreed. A month later, she brought a list, and there were discrepancies. The babies Claudia saw in the isolettes didn't match those given out for feeding. Blondes became brunettes. Large ones became small. This was evidence. Circumstantial, but evidence. Winter 1984 to 1985 was brutally cold. Springfield froze, turning into an icy city with frozen-through apartments and frost-covered windows. Margaret continued building her file. She met with mothers, recorded their stories. By New Year's, she had 18 documented switch cases. 18 mothers who knew they'd been given the wrong babies. 18 children living with strangers. 18 real children who were somewhere out there with those who'd paid. The strange infant they'd given her instead of her son was growing. They named him Alex, Dennis insisted, after his father. Margaret cared for him mechanically, fed, changed, treated his colds, but there was no love. She looked at the fair-haired boy and thought about the dark-haired one they'd taken. He was 9 months old now. He was sitting up, maybe trying to stand. Who was he? Where was he? Did the people who bought him love him? Dennis noticed something was wrong. "Marg, you seem distant with Alex. Do you love him?" Margaret nodded. "Of course, just tired." She couldn't tell her husband the truth. Dennis was a good man, but simple. He wouldn't understand. He'd think she'd gone crazy, or worse. He'd act straightforwardly, go to the hospital with his fists, and they'd just crush him. In the spring of 1985, something happened that changed everything. Cheryl, the lab tech Margaret had met a year ago, reached out on her own, called the house when Dennis wasn't home and said, "We need to meet. Urgent." They met at a park near the city library. Cheryl was pale as death, her hands shaking. "I'm quitting. Leaving Springfield. I have an aunt in Denver. I'm going to her. I can't see this anymore. Every week, these switches. Yesterday there were 2 cases. 2 in one day. I'm losing my mind." "Cheryl," Margaret said, holding her hands, "before you leave, help me. One last time. Photograph the logs, or steal one page, anything. I need evidence. I'll see this through to the end. I'll expose this system. But I need documents." Cheryl cried.
They'll kill me. You're leaving anyway. They won't find you in Denver. Please. Cheryl was silent, then nodded. Okay. One last time. Then I disappear and you forget I existed. 2 weeks later, they met again. Cheryl handed Margaret an envelope. Inside were 3 pages from the lab log, torn out. They had blood test records for newborns from April 1984. And there were corrections. You could see where they'd erased one blood type and written another, where they'd crossed out and changed. This was direct evidence of document falsification. Margaret pressed the envelope to her chest. Thank you. Thank you so much. Erase me from your memory, Cheryl said. I never knew you. She turned and left. Margaret never saw her again. Now she had evidence, documentary evidence of falsification. But where to go? The FBI? Possibly. But they might have Blackwood's connections. The state health department? Laughable. The baby switching system worked precisely for the rich and influential. They wouldn't allow publicity. And then Margaret remembered the FBI's white-collar crime division. Technically, this wasn't their profile. They dealt with financial crimes, not baby switching. But if you looked at babies as commodities being traded for money, this was theft. This was economics, underground trafficking. Plus, Lieutenant Henderson, the lab tech's husband, worked for the local police. That meant they knew. But not everyone. There must be honest people, those not in on it. She just had to find them. Margaret spent a month working to reach the right person. Through acquaintances, through friends of friends. Finally, they gave her a name. Special Agent Thomas Brennan. Worked in the FBI's Springfield office. Had a reputation for honesty and principle. They said he actually fought criminals rather than protecting them. In June 1985, Margaret went to see him. The office was small, with government-issue furniture and photos of presidents on the walls. Brennan turned out to be a man about 45 with a tired face and intelligent gray eyes. He listened to her calmly, without interrupting. She laid her notebook in front of him. 18 switch cases, names, dates, details. Showed him the torn pages from the lab log with corrections. Told him about the system, about Dr. Blackwood, about the wealthy people buying babies. Brennan listened, his face hardening. When she finished, he was silent for a long time. Then he said, "This is monstrous. If this is true, it's the most monstrous crime I've heard in my career. But you understand what position you're putting me in." "I understand," Margaret said. "You have to start an investigation. If I start an investigation and this turns out to be false, I'll be fired. If it's true and high-ranking people are involved, I'll also be fired, or arrested, or killed. You're giving me a case that could cost me my life." "And I lost my son," Margaret said quietly. "Someone's raising him. Strangers. Every day I think about him, where he is, whether he's healthy, whether he's happy. And I know there are at least 18 other mothers in the same position, and there will be more, every year, until this system is stopped." Brennan took the notebook, flipped through it, looked at the torn log pages. "I need time. I can't just launch an investigation of a hospital. I need grounds, an official reason. Give me a few months. I'll think about how to do this." Margaret left Brennan's office with hope, the first hope in a long year. But months passed. Brennan didn't contact her. Margaret tried to call him. They told her he was in the field, that he was busy, that he'd call back. He didn't call back. By the end of 1985, Margaret understood. Brennan had either gotten scared or been warned, or simply decided not to get involved. She was alone, with her notebook, with evidence, but with no way to do anything. Then she made another decision. If the system was closed from within, she needed to hit from outside. She needed to create a scandal, publicity.
People needed to know, many people, so it would be impossible to cover up. She began writing letters to Missouri senators, to the governor's office, to the New York Times, to the Washington Post, to 60 Minutes. She wrote in detail, citing facts, dates, names, attached copies, hand-transcribed, of the lab log pages,
Sent the letters certified with return receipt.
Responses started arriving a month later, standard brush-offs. Your letter has been reviewed, referred to the Missouri Department of Health. The circle closed. The letters returned to where it was all happening, to those in the system. But one letter got through. A letter to the Kansas City Star, to the investigative desk. A journalist named William Garrett responded. He wrote that the topic was interesting, but more substantial evidence was needed. If Margaret could find at least one mother willing to give an official interview under her real name and a doctor who would confirm the switching system, he was ready to pursue the story. Margaret began calling the mothers from her list. 18 women. She asked, "Are you willing to speak publicly, give an interview, tell your story under your real name?" All refused. Every one. Fear was stronger than pain. They'd been so intimidated that even after a year or more, they were afraid to open their mouths. They'd been convinced that any attempts at truth would lead to repercussions, and they were silent. Raising strangers' children and staying silent. Except one. Lisa, that same girl who'd been in the room with Margaret. She called herself in December 1985. "Margaret, this is Lisa. You remember me? I've been thinking for a long time, and I agree. I'll give an interview, let everyone know. I don't care anymore. Every day I look at this girl and know she's not mine, and where mine is, I don't know. And it's driving me crazy. At least this way I'll do something." Tears flowed from Margaret's eyes. Thank you so much." They met with journalist Garrett in January 1986. Lisa told her story, in detail, with specifics. Garrett recorded, asked questions. Then he asked, "Are there any doctors willing to confirm?" There were no doctors. Judith Crawford, the delivery nurse, refused to even talk. Cheryl had left and disappeared. Sharon Henderson, the senior lab tech, was in the system up to her neck. Others were silent. "Without medical personnel, the story won't run," Garrett said. "The paper won't print it. Too serious accusations. One mother's testimony isn't enough. We need medical staff." Margaret came home shattered. Dead end. Another dead end. 1986 was a year of despair. Alex turned 2. Margaret raised him, but without love. Dennis increasingly asked, "What's wrong with you? You've become so cold." They started fighting. Margaret couldn't explain. Her real son, whom she'd never seen again, was growing up somewhere. He was 2 years old too. He was talking, running, laughing, with strangers. In March 1986, Margaret decided on one last step. She went to the Missouri Department of Health and Senior Services, wrote an official complaint, laid out everything, asked them to investigate Memorial Hospital, compare newborn medical charts with mothers' statements, check lab logs for alterations. The response came a month later. Investigation conducted, no violations found. Your accusations deemed unfounded. Psychiatric consultation recommended. Margaret sat in her kitchen, holding this paper, and for the first time in 2 years, let herself cry. She'd lost. The system had won. Her son was lost forever. But 3 days later, Brennan called, that same FBI agent who'd promised to think about it a year ago and disappeared. "Mrs. Hartwell, this is Agent Brennan. I need to meet with you. Urgent." They met in Phelps Grove Park. April, early spring, snow still lying under trees. Brennan looked older than a year ago, tired and worn out. "I apologize for not contacting you for so long. I didn't abandon your case. I was just acting very carefully. I was investigating. Through shadow channels, through people I trust, and I found evidence. Margaret felt her heart beat faster. What kind? Financial. Dr. Eleanor Blackwood received large sums into her account, officially, as fees for consultations, gifts from grateful patients. Unofficially, payment for babies. I tracked the payments. Some came from high-ranking people, business executives, lawyers, doctors. Amounts from $3,000 to $10,000 per baby. That's enormous money. Is that enough to open a case? Not enough. Money can be explained. We need a connection between the money and specific switch cases. We need medical documents. We need witnesses from hospital staff. But most importantly, I need support from above. If I launch a solo investigation, they'll crush me. I talked to the U.S. Attorney for the Western District of Missouri. He's willing to support, but only if there's direction from Washington. He can't act against wealthy, influential people without backing. So it's another dead end? Not quite.
Things are changing in Washington. New administration priorities. Talk about fighting corruption, protecting civil rights. Maybe the climate is shifting. Maybe such a case will finally be heard. I need your materials, everything you have. I'll try to push this through the Justice Department. Margaret gave him her notebook. 2 years of work, 18 documented switch cases, names, dates, statements, copies of lab log pages, everything. If I lose this, I lose everything, she said. I won't lose it, Brennan promised. More than a year passed. Margaret waited. Every day she waited for a call. But the call didn't come. And then, in October 1986, something happened she never expected. Judith Crawford came to her home. That same delivery nurse who'd attended her birth and refused to talk. Judith was pale as death. She came into the apartment, sat, was silent for a long time. Then she spoke. They fired me. Found a pretext. Medication discrepancy. Complete nonsense. I worked honestly for 20 years, but they made it clear. Either I leave quietly, or they fabricate charges. I left. And then I thought for a long time, and decided, enough silence. I'll tell everything, officially, on the record. Let them arrest me, but I'll tell the truth. Margaret's breath caught. You're willing to give testimony? Yes. I saw the switches, many times. They ordered us. They'd bring a healthy baby, say, take this one to isolate 3, give the mother the one from isolate 5. We complied. We're afraid not to comply. Dr. Blackwood ruled the hospital with an iron fist. Anyone who didn't obey was out. But I remembered. I remember the babies' faces. I remember the mothers. I can identify them. Margaret grabbed the phone, called Brennan. I have a witness, a delivery nurse, ready to talk. Everything spun into motion. Brennan arrived within an hour. Judith gave her statement, detailed, with dates, with names. She named Dr. Blackwood, named the nurses who participated in the switches, named Sharon Henderson, the lab tech who falsified tests. The next day, Brennan went to Washington, to the Department of Justice, with the file, with testimony, with evidence. The response came a week later. The Department of Justice was directing the U.S. Attorney's Office to begin an investigation, an official, full-scale investigation of Memorial Hospital's maternity ward. The investigation began in November 1986. A team came from Washington. They entered the hospital with search warrants, seized medical charts, lab logs, financial documents, interrogated staff. Dr. Blackwood tried to resist, threatened, called someone higher up, but the climate really was changing. 1986 was the beginning of increased focus on corruption. Old connections no longer worked as reliably. They started calling in mothers. Margaret was one of the first. She gave testimony on the record, detailed,
clear. The investigator listened, wrote, shook his head. How could this have gone on for so many years? By the end of November, they'd called in all 18 mothers from Margaret's list. All gave testimony. All confirmed the switches. The picture was horrifying. For 10 years, from 1976 to 1986, at least 47 babies had been switched at Memorial Hospital. 47. Healthy infants were taken from ordinary mothers and given to wealthy families for large sums. In exchange, they gave sick babies or ones other mothers had abandoned. In December 1986, Dr. Eleanor Blackwood was arrested. Along with her, they arrested nurse Patricia Donovan, senior lab tech Sharon Henderson, and 3 other hospital employees. They filed federal charges: abuse of authority, document falsification, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit kidnapping. Interrogations began. Dr. Blackwood held out for 2 days, then broke, confessed to everything, explained how it worked. People came to her, wealthy, influential people who had problems having children or who wanted a healthy baby without genetic risks. They paid large sums, $10,000 for a boy, $7,000 for a girl. Dr. Blackwood would select a suitable newborn, healthy, from a young, educated mother, so the genetics would be good. She'd arrange the switch, give the real baby to the clients, substitute another for the mother, sick, with defects, or simply a relinquishment. Medical documents were falsified, blood tests were rewritten. If a mother started suspecting, they intimidated her with psychiatric commitment, pressure on her family. Dr. Blackwood split the money with accomplices: Nurse Donovan for switching babies at feeding time, Lab Tech Henderson for falsifying tests, janitors for silence. The scheme worked like clockwork. But the most terrible thing was different. When investigators began comparing data, it turned out that some of the sick babies substituted for healthy ones weren't actually sick. They were simply declared sick. Fake diagnoses were written for credibility, so mothers wouldn't suspect they'd been given a specially selected baby. And some babies were taken from foster care altogether, brought to the hospital, passed off as newborns. All documents falsified. This was a monstrous, refined machine for trafficking children, and it had operated for 10 years. 10 years. The hardest part was finding the children, those real ones who'd been taken from their mothers. Investigators began searching for them, following financial trails. Dr. Blackwood, under pressure, started naming names. Who took babies? Where they gave them. Some children were found quickly. They were being raised by families in Springfield and nearby areas. Business executives, lawyers, professors. When investigators came to them, there were scandals, hysterics, threats. "This is our child. We love him. You have no right." But the investigation was relentless. They conducted comprehensive checks, compared blood types of parents and children, checked for matching birthmarks, distinguishing features, anthropometric data recorded at birth. If all signs pointed to a switch, the child was returned to biological parents. Some children weren't found. They'd been taken to other cities, Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, or even abroad. Some wealthy people had moved for business and taken the purchased baby with them. Searches continued, but not all could be found. Margaret's son was found in February 1987. He was almost 3 years old. He was being raised by the family of the assistant director of operations at a major manufacturing company. A high-ranking executive, wealthy, whose wife couldn't have children after a botched surgery. They'd paid Dr. Blackwood $8,000. Got a healthy boy with dark hair and good genetics. Named him Ryan. Loved him, raised him as their own. When investigators came to them, a terrible scene occurred. The man's wife fainted. The husband shouted that he wouldn't give up the child, that this was his son, that he'd raised him for 3 years. But verification was merciless. Blood type matched Margaret and Dennis. The birthmark on his left shoulder was the one Margaret had seen in the delivery room. Anthropometric data at birth matched. This was her son, her biological son, and by law, he had to be returned. Margaret met her son on February 15, 1987. This was in the federal building, in the presence of an investigator and a psychologist. The boy was 2 years and 10 months old. Dark-haired, gray-eyed, looked like Dennis. On his left shoulder, that same birthmark Margaret had glimpsed in the delivery room almost 3 years ago. She looked at him and couldn't say a word. This was her son, her child they'd taken, but he didn't recognize her. He clung to the other woman, the one who'd raised him for 3 years, calling her Mommy. He cried when they tried to lead him to Margaret. He was afraid of her. The psychologist explained, for a child, mother is the person who's been there since birth. Biological connection means less than emotional bond. The boy was used to that family. To him, they were parents. Tearing him away from them, that was trauma. What should I do? Margaret asked. It's your decision, the psychologist said. You have every right to take your son. This is your child. But you must understand that for him, this will be catastrophic. He'll have to adapt to new people, a new home. This could damage his psyche. The alternative? Leave him with that family, but with your right to participate in his life? Or find some compromise solution. Margaret met with that family, with the executive and his wife. They cried, begged, promised anything. Please don't take him from us. We love him. We'll give you any amount of money. You can see him as much as you want, but don't tear him away from us. Margaret thought for a week. She consulted with Dennis, with psychologists, with lawyers, and made the hardest decision of her life. She left her son with that family. They officially arranged guardianship with Margaret's right to regular visits and participation in raising him. The boy continued living with those he knew as parents, but Margaret got the right to see him twice a week, participate in his life, be part of his world. Why? Dennis asked. He's our son. You searched for him for 3 years. Because I'm a mother, Margaret answered, and a mother doesn't think about herself. She thinks about her child. It's better for him to stay where he grew up. I don't want to ruin his life. But what about Alex, that fair-haired boy they'd given her instead of her son? Investigators found his real mother, a woman from a working-class family who delivered at Memorial Hospital in April 1984. She'd been given a sick baby. She'd raised him for 2.5 years, but his condition gradually worsened due to a congenital defect. And her real son, healthy, was growing up with Margaret. When that woman was told her son was alive, that he'd been switched, that he was healthy, she didn't believe it at first. Then she cried for 3 hours straight. Then she came to Margaret. They met on neutral territory, 2 mothers whose children had been stolen and given strangers. The conversation was difficult. That woman wanted to take Alex. He was her son, her blood. Margaret understood. But for Alex, she was Mommy. He knew only her. 3 years of life. They found a compromise. Alex stayed with Margaret, but his real mother got visitation rights. Gradually, carefully, they explained the situation to him, as much as you can explain to a 3-year-old that he has 2 mothers. The trial of Dr. Blackwood and her accomplices began in March 1987. An open trial in federal court. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, mothers whose babies had been switched, curious onlookers. The case received publicity. The press wrote about it. Monstrous crime at hospital. Underground baby trafficking. How the wealthy bought children. Dr. Blackwood was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. Nurse Donovan, 10 years. Lab Tech Henderson, 8 years. Other accomplices, sentences from 5 to 7 years. Memorial Hospital's maternity ward was closed for 6 months for complete review and reorganization. But most importantly, several dozen cases were opened against those who'd bought babies. Executives, lawyers, doctors. Some were convicted. Some were simply fired with ruined reputations. The system cracked, and Margaret Hartwell, the young mother who 3 years earlier had simply noticed they'd given her the wrong baby, stood outside the courthouse watching the convicted being led away. She'd done what she had to. She'd destroyed a machine that trafficked children, saved dozens of future infants from being switched. But the price was high. Her own son was growing up in another family. She saw him twice a week, but to him she was Aunt Margaret, not Mom. The strange child they'd substituted wasn't fully hers either. His real mother also participated in raising him. Margaret lived between two worlds, between two children, unable to call either one only hers. Years passed. Reagan gave way to Bush, then Clinton. Margaret divorced Dennis. Their marriage couldn't survive this trial. She devoted herself to work and to the two boys who were both her sons, though differently. In 1995, when both boys were 11, Ryan, her biological son, came to her on his own. His adoptive parents had died in a car accident. He had no one left, only Margaret. And he said, "Can I live with you? You're my real mom." Margaret hugged him and cried. For the first time in 11 years, she cried not from pain, but from happiness. Her son had come back. Not because a court decided, not because she'd fought, but because he chose her himself. Alex, the fair-haired boy they'd substituted, also stayed with her. His biological mother remarried and moved to another state. She visited her son once a year, but Alex always called Margaret Mom. She'd raised him. She'd given him life, not biological, but the one that matters more: love and care. In 2005, when both sons were 21, they came to Margaret together. Ryan and Alex, so different. One dark, one fair, one her blood, one her choice. And Ryan said, "Mom, we want to thank you for not giving up, for fighting, for destroying that system, for loving us both. You're a real mother, the best." Margaret looked at her boys, now adults, accomplished, good men, and understood. She'd made the right choice. All those years of struggle, pain, loss, they weren't in vain. She'd saved not only her son, she'd saved dozens of children who might have been switched in the future. She'd stopped a monstrous machine. The story of Memorial Hospital became legend. Books were written about it. Documentaries were made. Margaret Hartwell became a symbol of maternal love and resilience, a woman who went against the system and won. But for herself, it wasn't victory. It was simply life. The life of a mother who loved her children, both biological and non-biological, who learned that motherhood isn't just biology, it's choice. Every day, the choice to love, care for, protect. And she made that choice. Twice. Dr. Eleanor Blackwood died in prison in 1993. She was 62. Nurse Donovan served her full sentence, was released in 1997, lived out her years in a nursing home. Lab Tech Henderson was released on parole in 1992, moved to relatives in Montana. Memorial Hospital's maternity ward resumed operations after reorganization. They instituted strict controls. Mothers were allowed to be present for all procedures with newborns. Mandatory photo documentation of each infant immediately after birth was introduced. ID bracelets were put on in the delivery room, with the mother present. The system became transparent. But cases of baby switching in American hospitals weren't only in Springfield. It was widespread practice. In the 80s, similar schemes were uncovered in 3 other cities: Everywhere the same story. Healthy babies taken from ordinary mothers and sold to the wealthy. The corruption system had penetrated even where there should only be joy. Delivery rooms. Margaret lived a long life. She died in 2020 at age 60. Both sons were by her side, 4 grandchildren. At the funeral, dozens of women gathered, those same mothers she'd helped find the truth. They brought flowers, cried, spoke words of gratitude, and on the headstone they engraved simple words: a mother who wouldn't give up. Because maternal love is the strongest force on earth, stronger than fear, stronger than the system, stronger than time. And Margaret Hartwell proved it with her life. The Memorial Hospital story is about how corruption penetrates the most sacred, how a system can turn children into commodities, how people cloaked in authority can do monstrous things. But it's also about how there are always those who won't break, who will fight, who will see it through no matter what. 47 babies were switched over 10 years. 47 families lived with strangers' children, not knowing the truth. 32 children were found and returned. 15 remained missing, their trails lost in the vast country or beyond its borders. But the main thing, the system was destroyed. After the Memorial Hospital case, new regulations were introduced nationwide. Controls were strengthened. Procedures were made transparent. Switches became virtually impossible. This happened because of one mother who simply looked at the infant they brought her and knew, this is not my child. And she didn't accept it, didn't submit, didn't forget. She fought for 3 years, collected evidence, sought witnesses, wrote letters, met with officials, endured threats, lived in fear, but didn't give up. And won. Because a mother's heart can't be fooled. It knows the truth, always knows. And if you listen to that truth, if you fight for it, you can change the world. Margaret Hartwell changed the world. For 47 families. For thousands of future infants who would never be switched. For a system that was supposed to protect, not trade. She was an ordinary woman, an engineer, a wife, a mother. But at the moment when the system tried to break her, she proved stronger than the system. And that's what matters most. Because each of us may find ourselves in a situation where the system says, accept it, submit, forget. And our choice determines whether we submit or fight. Margaret chose to fight and won. Her story is a reminder that good exists, that justice is achievable, that even the most monstrous system can be destroyed by one person, if that person has the courage not to give up. April 15th, 1984. Margaret Hartwell looked at a stranger's infant and knew they'd given her the wrong son. March 15th, 1987. Dr. Eleanor Blackwood was sentenced to 15 years in prison for organizing underground baby trafficking. Between those dates, 3 years of struggle, pain, despair, hope. 3 years that changed everything. And when young mothers today leave hospitals with their babies, they don't even know that someone once fought so they'd be given their own children. So there would be no switches. So there would be no fear. So the joy of motherhood would remain joy, not nightmare. Margaret Hartwell won that battle, an ordinary woman who became a hero, a mother who wouldn't give up.